the rise of industrialization and consolidation of lands into larger nations. Frictions between European powers led to the development of general staffs dedicated to planning and managing future military conflicts. The Prussians led the way in the early 19th century, when in 1810, King Wilhelm I established a staff college with a primary focus on clerical and map-reading instruction. In 1857, Count Helmuth von Moltke, often referred to as Moltke the Elder, was appointed Prussian Chief of General Staff. Under his guidance, the General Staff and War College began to train the young officers to think like a general through war games, staff rides, and developing in-depth solutions to strategic problems. After decisive victories over Austria in 1866 and France in 1870, other European powers began to emulate Prussian staff methodology. Notably, France established the École de Guerre in 1880 and the School for Marshals in 1908. By the early 1900s, all European powers had military plans that their staffs had developed and shelved only to be used if needed in the future. These strategic plans were held as state secrets. Mobilization of a large Continental Army became the focus of strategic planning. Precise mobilization schedules, including railroad timetables for every unit, animal, armament, and munition, along with the food and supplies necessary to maintain an army on the move. Vast amounts of rolling stock had to be coordinated to allow a smooth deployment. In the 70 years before the Great War, the European railroad network increased dramatically. In the 10-year period leading up to 1855, rail increased fourfold from 1,200 miles to 4,800 miles in the future consolidated Germany. While from 1870 to the outbreak of the Great War in 1914, European rail tripled to 180,000 miles of track. The art of mobilization of men, material, and equipment to reach marshalling areas near the border for deployment became a mathematical calculation of rolling stock moving at a set speed. Episode 1. This three-part series will attempt to provide background and context for each of the Continental powers plus the United Kingdom. Episode 1 addresses the evolution of military planning and mobilization and Germany's solution for a two-front war. Episode 2 will take up France and Russia's mobilization plans after suffering significant defeats on the battlefield. Episode 3 will discuss Austria-Hungary's precarious position in Central Europe and the United Kingdom's role on the continent to ensure sovereignty of the Low Countries. Under the guidance of Moltke the Elder, and later Count Alfred von Waldersee, the new state of Germany focused on a two-front war with Russia on the east and France to the west. At this time, the strategic thinking was a defensive war along the Rhine with France, while the main force would make a limited advance into Russia to secure the Polish lands. In 1891, Count Alfred von Schlieffen was appointed Chief of the Imperial German General Staff. Schlieffen was born in Berlin in 1833. As a young officer, he served in the 1866 war with Austria and the 1870 war with France. Schlieffen attended the Prussian War College where he was a student of Moltke the Elder, while later he served as Prussian Army historian before becoming Chief of Staff. Schlieffen's academic approach led him to believe the key to victory was in the West, and not in the East as his predecessors thought. Based upon his general ledger approach, he concluded, France was weaker than Germany, but protected by forts. Russia was weaker than Germany, but protected by open space. Austria-Hungary was a weak ally that was hostile to Russia. Italy was a weak ally that did not enter into the equation. Britain was a naval power and therefore did not deserve consideration. Schlieffen's leadership placed the focus to the west, and by 1894 he was developing a plan to destroy the French forts on the frontier. France was in the process of making many upgrades to their forts along the borders during this period. And by 1897, the Germans realized their artillery was not sufficient to subdue the hardened emplacements. At this stage, the plan started developing as an outflanking maneuver through neutral Luxembourg and Belgium. Schlieffen retired at the end of 1905 and was replaced by Count Helmuth von Moltke, the nephew of the former chief of staff who is often referred to as Moltke the Younger. One of Schlieffen's last acts was to issue the Great Memorandum. The Great Memorandum included violating Luxembourg and Belgium by marching through their lands to reach the French frontier 27 days after mobilization, or M+27. 5 days later, M+32, armies to reach the Somme and Meuse rivers. At this point, the right flank was to turn south, ending up west of Paris, thus encircling the French army as the German left wing advanced from Alsace-Lorraine. By M+42, the war in the west would be concluded, and the army would be transported back to the east for operations against Russia. It is therefore essential to accelerate the advance of the German right wing as much as possible. The army commanders must be constantly on alert and distribute the marching routes appropriately. The plan made two fatal assumptions. First, that Luxembourg and Belgium would allow the German armies free access to pass through their lands. Second, that the German army could defeat France in 6 weeks before the Russian army could mobilize. Over the next 7 years, Schlieffen continued to work on the plan while in retirement, making adjustments for rail and road network developments. The networks within Belgium and France were constraints identified at the time and would be an issue when the plan was utilized in the autumn of 1914.